Hello, Father Rich here in the Rectory Dining Room at Our Lady of Peace. We're here for our 13th masterpiece from the series, a book called The 75 Masterpieces Every Christian Should Know by Terry Glaspey. Number 13, arguably one of the most famous of the masterpieces, the one I've seen the most, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I'm here in front of a copy of the middle of that great fresco by Michelangelo, The Creation of Man by God, that was donated to the rectory about 3 or 4 years ago. And I was remember studied in Rome for 4 years in the seminary, so the one place probably most often that people wanted to go to outside of St. Peter's was the Vatican Museums and the Sistine Chapel. So I had a chance to take many visitors there and get to see it. We were blessed to be there right after St. John Paul II had renovated it in 1994. And so we were there 3 years after it was renovated and really got to see it in all its glory. So Michelangelo, the famous sculptor, the author mentions that probably this masterpiece, there was no masterpiece in this series that probably was done with more trepidation and less enthusiasm than this, because Michelangelo, his gift was sculpting, and that was his experience. He thought that was what he was gifted to do, and so he didn't think he was that good of an artist, and didn't think he could do a good job. Thought maybe that some of his competitors were trying to set him up for failure. Pope Julius II, who was one of the Renaissance popes, unfortunately kind of most famous for corruption and excessive wealth and kind of focus on worldly things, he had initially commissioned Michelangelo to do his tomb. And Michelangelo was ready to do that with sculpting and all that. Well, that fell through for different reasons, one of which is probably couldn't afford it and the money ran out. He was heading back to Florence, gets called back by the Pope to do the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And the Sistine Chapel had been built at 1477 to 1480. It's the exact size of Solomon's Temple, which I had forgotten, but the chapter reminds us. So this would have been about 30 years later. They're doing the ceiling. And so Michelangelo reluctantly agreed to do it, and obviously ended up doing it, a magnificent job. He focuses on 3 stories from Genesis in the middle of the ceiling, the creation of man, the fall of man, and then kind of the fall of Noah, so to speak, that are 3 scenes from Genesis. There are 7 prophets and 5 Greek sibyls painted around the outside of those main 3 panels and images. There are actually over 300 figures in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And just beautifully done. It's almost the images come to life, the dimension. It's almost as if the author mentions he sculpted the ceiling. He built his own scaffolding to be able to get up there and it took him 4 years to do it. Probably not in the way that is sometimes romanticized, that he laid on his back and was the whole time, but stood up and obviously had the scaffolding and had to move it around. But so you see the great real devotion and faith of Michelangelo depicted, and his knowledge of the Bible. They mentioned in here that he really was a faithful man and knew his stuff, and that is reflected in his work. And so the other thing I was going to mention, they actually have an exhibit going around different parts of the United States. I was able to get down to it in Pittsburgh, where they allow you to go. They do an exhibit of the ceiling, and you can get up close, and they tell you all the information about the different panels. So you should keep your eyes out for that if you ever hear that come through or close to town. But they talk more about, and beyond even the beauty of the actual Sistine Chapel, the life of Michelangelo. He was born in, I think, 1475 in Florence. He grew up under the influence of, in the context of a lot of artistry, and the big influence on him was the Medici family from Florence. They were a main leading family, very powerful, and also had a great commitment to the arts. So under Lorenzo de Medici, he had learned and was brought in and learned under a man by the name of Domenico Ghirlandaio, who was a famous sculptor of that time. And obviously the student, Michelangelo, eventually outgrew and outdid his master. But he did the Pietà in Rome at the age of 25. So young that they questioned whether he could have been the actual sculptor. But in fact he was. It's still well known there in St. Peter's Basilica as one of the greatest pieces of sculpture in the world. And then he did the David in Florence. They're out of one stone. It's about 12 feet high. It's and no other artist and sculptor wanted to deal with this piece of rock. It was kind of considered a misfit, and he ended up doing this incredible work of David. He would talk about his sculpture, and he said when he was talking about one of the angels that he did, he said, "Hey, I saw the angel in the rock, and I freed the angel from the rock." So that was how his approach to his sculpting, that he would see the image as he, and just release it. He could see it when he would look at the rock. And so then eventually he was called in to do the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and then 30 years later he would be called in to do the wall over the altar in the Sistine Chapel, and the Last Judgment, another hugely famous piece of work. It was a fresco again, and it depicts the Last Judgment, heaven and hell, assumingly very influenced by Dante, the Divine Comedy, which we already spoke about, and other pieces of work like the Garden of Heavenly Delights that we talked about. His hell is very ghoulish and very kind of over the top, and it's kind of scariness. So Michelangelo, a great man of devotion. He also was very influenced by Savonarola, assumingly, who was a Dominican monk in Florence in the late 1400s, kind of an enemy of the Medicis, questioned and challenged the corruption of the church and its excessiveness. And he was eventually, unfortunately, executed because of how much he challenged and questioned the church. But they say kind of his spirituality and his negative focus really impacted Michelangelo quite a bit, presumptively. And so Michelangelo kind of had that negative spirituality. He knew his sinfulness, but he also knew the great mercy of God, and he trusted in that, and he hoped in that. But that was reflected in that Last Judgment particularly, but some of his other work. So I'd like to end with a quote from St. John Paul II when he opened up and had the first Mass in the Sistine Chapel after they renovated it in 1994. This is what he would say about the chapel. "The Sistine Chapel is precisely, if one may say so, the sanctuary of the theology of the human body." And remember, the theology of the body, St. John Paul II had introduced the church to about 15 years earlier. His first 5 years of his papacy, every Wednesday he developed a theology that in the end was a summary of the theology of the body I talked about in another one of the masterpieces. But this positive perspective on the gift of our human sexuality and the body and sex in the context of marriage. And so he's kind of referring to that. In witnessing to the beauty of man created by God as male and female, it also expresses in a certain way the hope of the world transfigured, of a world transfigured. In the context of the light that comes from God, the human body also keeps its splendor and its dignity. So that's the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. Our next masterpiece will be number 14, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," the hymn by Martin Luther. Hope you can join us for that. But thank you for being here in this video. Have a great day. God bless.